and this is my pleasure to welcome you to this masterclass on how to manage the interface between marine, coastal, and land ecosystems. And in this masterclass, we will have two talks of 15 minutes each, and then approximately 30-minute time for discussion and questions. So, just before starting our workshop, please allow me to mention two numbers. First one, blue economy represents about 5.5 million jobs and generates a GVA of about 500 billion a year. So we will start with the first talk given by Professor Alice Newton. Alice Newton is a professor in the Department of Chemistry and Pharmacy at the Faculty of Science and Technology of the University of Algarve in Portugal. She was head of this institute from 2002 to 2006. And Professor Newton has taken several duties in Portugal and abroad, and worth mentioning is her activity as a principal investigator at the Norwegian Institute of Air Research, so-called NILU. So she's a senior author and co-author of 52 publications since 2003 and has been invited for several keynotes at international conferences in the past decade. And most importantly, Alice Newton has been actively advising the European Commission for the redaction of important guidance documents such as the Water Framework Directive, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and the Comprehensive Atmospheric Monitoring Program elaborated by the Oslo-Paris Convention. The title of our talk is Land-Ocean Interaction in the Coastal Zone. Please, Alice, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really an honor to be here today and to talk to you about the land-ocean interactions in the coastal zone. I was the chairperson of land-ocean interactions in the coastal zone for 3 years, and therefore when the conference asked me to talk about this topic, I said that I would be very, very honored to come here and talk about it. So I'm going to focus on the bioeconomy in the coastal zone, and I will tell you a little bit about the project Land-Ocean Interactions. So this is the content of my talk. I'll speak a little bit about the LOICS approach, so I don't have to keep saying land-oceans interactions in the coastal zone. I'll talk a little about the coastal zone blue economy and blue carbon in the coastal zone, and also the bioeconomy in the coastal zone. I'm going to talk and focus on issues that are arising and conflicts, and then talk about 3 different frameworks that LOICS uses when it's dealing with socio-ecological systems in the coastal zone. And then I'll wrap up, and I hope to do that in 15 minutes. So fasten your seatbelts. So the LOICS approach, I've bolded some key words here so that I don't have to read it all out. LOICS 1 was all about fluxes. It was about fluxes of nutrients, about eutrophication, and it was about fluxes of sediments. But LOICS 2, which I was the chair of at the beginning of the LOICS 2 program, is about sustainability of the world's coastal zone, and it's about the community as well. So LOICS 1 was about the biosphere and the geosphere, but LOICS 2 actually also includes the human dimension, and that's a very important step that LOICS made, linking how human beings and how live in the coastal zone contribute to the problems, but also benefit from the coastal zone. So about 40 to 50% of the EU population lives within 50 kilometers from the sea. And we can see that quite clearly when we look at the map of the of the Earth from satellites at night, you can see that the lit zone very clearly outlines the borders of the coastlines. And many, many coastlines in Europe are now very urban. In some countries, it's up to 80% of the population that lives in the coastal zone. So this is obviously a very important zone that people are attracted to live in. Why are they attracted to live in there? It's because not only does it provide a lot of benefits living in there, but it's also a very beautiful place. So people want to go to the coastal zone, not just to work because of the benefits and the ecosystem services that the coastal zone provides, but also because it's a beautiful place to spend their holidays. And sometimes this causes added stresses to the coastal zone, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So, as you said, the blue economy in the coastal zone is very important. About 40% of the EU GDP is generated in the maritime regions. We're talking about 5.5 million jobs and about 500 billion euros a year. So this is obviously a huge sector that we need to consider carefully. And if you look at the maritime regions and the strategy for the EU, there are 5 different areas. And I'm going to focus on the first 2, aquaculture and fisheries. And I'm going to focus on marine biotechnology. But I'll also mention some of the conflicts that are occurring with coastal tourism, ocean energy, and seabed mining. So what about the bioeconomy in the coastal zone? What are the lessons that we've learned? Why did LOIX, for instance, change its strategy and bring in the human dimension? And where's the innovation? So, strangely enough, fisheries is an activity. It's one of the few activities that remain from very, very long time ago, where we're actually hunting animals. The thing is, we're hunting them more and more efficiently. And because we're hunting them more and more efficiently, we're removing sometimes more than we should. But the fisheries should be sustainable, and if they're managed properly, they will be sustainable. Aquaculture is far more like farming, and again, this is an activity that has a long history, but in the past 100 years, it's really taken off. And in some of the countries in the EU, it's a very important sector now. Marine biotechnology. This is also a sector that has an old history. For instance, the purple from the robes of the robes of the Roman emperors were dyed from a dye that came from a mollusk. But of course we used too many of them, so that mollusk collapsed completely. So if we use the sea in an intelligent way, and if we use it in a sensible and a well-managed way, this has endless, endless bounties. But we can also have terrible collapses and change the ecosystem so that it cannot recover. So we were talking this morning, Gunter Pauli showed some very nice slides. I noticed nobody who said that they were from Sweden, but there's quite a few Norwegians in the room. And I have seen Norwegians eat fish roe. And I've actually indulged in it myself, and it's very nice. But of course, overfishing does threaten future reproductive capacity. So we do have to be a little bit careful about how we fish and what we fish for. If you look at the reports about overfishing, it's a sad story. In the Northeast Atlantic, 39% of the fish stocks are overfished, and in the Mediterranean and Black Sea, the picture is much worse, 88%. So today we had a very interesting presentation about the possibility of sustainable tuna, and gentlemen from the Commission also brought up the funding that's gone into farming tuna. And so yes, we can change our behavior, we can also change the way we exploit the sea, and hopefully we can develop some new and more sustainable ways. But for the moment, it's looking pretty grim. Only about 10% of the assessments of marine habitats and 3% of the marine species under Natura are considered to be favourable. So we've got a long way to go. But there is hope. And I was sorry this morning that the lady who was supposed to represent ISIS wasn't able to join us, because ISIS is doing a lot of work, and a lot of very useful work. And there's lots of projects going on in Europe, being supported by Europe, to make European fisheries ecosystem plans operational, and also integration of aquaculture and fisheries. So plug for my colleague here. We have a new common fisheries policy that incorporates some of these new ideas about how to make the sea more sustainable. And we have a marine directive, Sea for Life. I was very unpopular when I was designing a curriculum for sustainable use of coasts. And I invited an Icelandic member of the scientific community to talk about sustainable fisheries. He's actually in the room. And at the time, I was very unpopular because people said, well, we've got plenty of fisheries biologists. And I said, yes, but are fisheries sustainable? At the time, the situation was even worse than it is now. And he gave some very nice classes. Thank you very much. So the fisheries, even though they're collapsing, the catch is going up and up and up, and that's because we're becoming more effective and we're putting more effort into the catch. But also something that's important is the growth of the aquaculture sector. Aquaculture is now approaching 50% of the global seafood production. And shellfish are the largest aquaculture crop. There's a huge production of bivalves. And I noticed I must update some of these because there's some new figures out very recently, some new reports. So I can actually go back to, I can go up to 2010 now, 2011. Also, we had a lady from New Zealand make a presentation this morning, and she didn't mention the green lip mussel. But the story of the mussel is really interesting. For instance, in Portugal, we didn't grow very much mussel. And when the economy went down, the Portuguese prefer vongole, you know, the clams. And when the economy went down, because they still like the bivalves, the price of the mussels, there was more interest in mussels, a much cheaper product. But strangely enough, the restaurants still use the green lip mussels from New Zealand. So even though it's a low-cost product, they can add the added value onto the product. They produce it in such a nice way and package it in such a good way that it can be transported to Europe and still be profitable and outcompete some of the local producers. And since we were talking about the circular economy, what shall we do with the shells? So all aquaculture is not created equal, and shellfish farming is not the same as fish farming, although they're put into the same pot. Shellfish are low down the food web, and algae are even lower. They're the basis of the food web. So cultivating algae and cultivating shellfish has huge benefits for the coastal zone. Shellfish boosts all sorts of ecosystem services, and so do algae. Algae produce oxygen and they mop up nutrients. Aquaculture structures that for the bivalves provide habitats and protection for the larval and juvenile fish and invertebrates. And filter feeding bivalves reduce sediment loads and turbidity and remove excess nutrients also. Now, I'd like to come to biotechnology. And when I was looking, it's not my topic of research, but when I was looking at the sites of the EU and looking at what was going on in biotechnology and eco-innovation, I found some interesting projects have been funded, such as, I like to think of it as the Taste Miracle. So the Taste Miracle is, the Taste Project is applying edible seaweed extracts for taste enhancement and for salt replacement. And the Miracle one is about sustainable biorefinery designs for algal biomass. And the plant pack is interesting because it it's a coating that you put on food packaging, but this coating comes from seaweed extracts and starch, so it's biodegradable. So we had a talk this morning about Horizon 2020 by Mayor, and she talked about bioeconomy, about the oceans and seas. She mentioned that as well. And obviously there's going to be lots of opportunities, not just for research, but for demonstration. And the pictures on the slide, this one is a big biofuels farm. And the reason I chose this one is because it's not in the EU, it's in Arizona. And it's because it's on marginal land. It's land that cannot be used to grow normal plants. And so they can use it for growing algae. And on the right-hand side, you'll see some products from a little startup firm that one of my ex-students, he's now working on biodiesels and also on products for the beauty industry. So boosting ecosystem services, that's a definite added value to the aquaculture industry. These bivalve bags, they produce food for us, but they also produce habitat. The fishermen really like it because they find that the fish are attracted to these structures, and they can go around and they can fish around these structures. At first they were not so happy about the structures being put out at sea, but now they're happy about it. And also they provide a biofilter. One thing I haven't mentioned is blue carbon in the coastal zone. And again, all plants are not created equal. So the wetlands and the salt marshes, we don't have mangroves in Europe, but the salt marshes capture a lot of blue carbon. The seagrasses do as well, and seaweeds much less. So all plants are not created equal, but it's nonsense for us to be destroying our wetlands and destroying our salt marshes. They're very, very important in the carbon cycle. I said that I would talk about issues arising and conflicts. There are conflicts often between the aquaculture industry and the fishermen, which I hope you've resolved. Another plug for the book. There's also a problem of marine litter. Both the aquaculture industry and the fishing industry produce a lot of litter. And one of the problems that's arising is the problem of aesthetics, especially in areas that are important for tourism. People are not very happy sometimes to have aquaculture in front of their view. So how do we manage this? In LOICS, we use 3 different types of frameworks, and we're working to use a unified framework. So the first one we're using is the DPSIR framework. It comes from the OECD initially, and then it was adopted by EEA, and by UNEP also have used it. And we use this framework a lot when we're looking at adaptive management of the coastal zone. However, the DPSIR framework has some things that are really useful that are missing. And we find this in the SAF, the System Approach Framework. The System Approach Framework was developed as a result of a big European project with 54 partners. And it was tested at 16 sites all over Europe, right from the Arctic, from the Norwegian Arctic, right to Turkey. So it had a really good test in 16 different coastal programs. And one of the nice things in the SAF is that it identifies the issue. You need to identify the issue in order to be able to identify the stakeholders who should be involved. Now, I was at the HOPE conference earlier on this year in May in Brussels, and we were talking about what the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and eutrophication is one of the descriptors, but the fertilizer industry and the agricultural industry was not around the table. They were not even at the conference. So, it's really important to have the right stakeholders in the room, and the SAF clearly shows that. The Ostrom framework, we're working with this now in 3 sites, actually outside of the European Union, but it's funded by the European Union. We're working in Colombia, in Argentina, and in Mexico, using the Ostrom framework for managing socio-ecological system. And she really emphasized the importance about community-based management. And the more I see it, the more I'm convinced that actually the community-based management is the best way forward. So that if the community of fishermen and the community of aquaculture can get together and manage their system, you can get some very good results. So, conclusion, how am I doing for time? Am I okay? Conclusion, we can have sustainable fisheries, but we have to manage our fisheries well. We can have sustainable aquaculture. We have to be careful how we do our aquaculture. Maybe not capture so much wild fish to feed the aquaculture organisms. We can also boost ecosystem services, and marine biotechnology has great opportunities. So there is hope for healthy oceans and productive ecosystems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice. Unless there are some urgent questions from the audience, we can move to the next talk that will be given by Professor Øyvind Berg. He's a principal scientist at the Institute of Marine Research in Bergen, Norway, and adjunct professor at the University of Bergen. His main research interests are interactions between aquaculture and the environment, aquaculture and whitefish problems, with special emphasis on spreading of diseases. Further, he works with impacts of climate changes on aquaculture. He has published above 70 papers in international refereed journals, and he has been coordinating the EU FP7 KBB project, Coexist, Interaction in European Coastal Waters, a roadmap to sustainable integration of aquaculture and fisheries. The title of Professor Berg's talk is Sustainable Integration of Aquaculture and Fisheries. So please, Berg.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thanks for inviting me. I'm just following up, just advertising for our book for the Coexist project, as my colleague very nicely did. I brought some of the copies here, so for those who are interested, please have them afterwards. I also left some brochures for the project and also for another project, which is called Mermaid, which I'm going to tell a little about towards the end of my talk. I've been coordinator of the Coexist project since 2010. It's now closed. It's on integration of fisheries, aquaculture, and other uses of the coastal zone in Europe. I will start with the same framework as my colleague just did. There are competing claims in the coastal zones. It's not a European problem, it's a global problem. People want to live along the coastal zones. There are a lot of important things going on along the coastal zones. The Coexist project I will talk about, and the case studies and the aquaculture versus fisheries, and a little on legislation and on impacts of diseases of aquaculture, and some on how we are using various models to reduce the impact of diseases and other environmental impacts of the aquaculture. To get improved management. It's very much about space management. It's very much about how to manage the way that aquaculture and fisheries interact and how they interact with other users. There are a lot of various policy drivers within the Union and the European Economic Area that are important for this. The Marine Strategy Framework Directive, of course. There are cross-cutting policies, etc., and there is a strong wish to get the blue growth. We can ask whether there is a strong blue growth. There is a possibility for a strong blue growth. It could be the best we can say about that. If we take an analyze on the global issue on the coastal zones, aquaculture is causing increased pressure on the coastal zone. It's increasing globally fast. It's not increasing within the European Union. It's increasing within Europe as a whole, but it's the associated states in the EEA and other countries with good agreements with the European Union, like Turkey, who has an increasing aquaculture industry, making the statistics a little bit less bad for the continent as a whole. But still, this continent is dependent on importing a lot of seafood. Fisheries are at its best stagnant. There are conflicts with other users because there are increasing pressures from others. Tourism is increasing, having conflicts with other users. There is an extreme growth potential in the energy sector, wind farms and wave farms. Actually, there is a lot of energy along the coastal zone. And of course, marine protected areas are also a way of using area. So in this context, it's a competitor to the other uses of the coastal zones. There are important things going on historically now. You just showed the picture of how aquaculture is growing. This is actually the amount of fish going to human consumption from aquaculture and fisheries. And from Ferreira's model, João Ferreira, a partner in the Coexist project, we can estimate that in September 2011, the same thing happened in the sea that happened on the transition from the older Paleolithic period to the younger Paleolithic period. Man stopped being just a hunter. No, he's a farmer. Aquaculture is no more important than fisheries. And this is really an historic development, and it can be assumed to increase. And this is, of course, the global issue. Now, so just take a little look about the carrying capacity or sustainability issues. I think it's important to notice that there are different concepts of sustainability and carrying capacity around the world. In Europe and in US and Canada, we tend to look at production and ecological factors as the most important things, whereas in Southeast Asia, and especially in China, social and governance aspects are more important. If you ask any Chinese politician what is the most important part of sustainability, he will answer ensuring that there is feed for the people, there is food availability for the people. It's historic reasons, but it's very, very important to say that enough seafood available for the people is a part of sustainability globally. Aquaculture, fisheries, and the other users are in the coastal zone. The Coexist project was in the interface of those. We had 13 partners in 10 different European countries. We had 6 different case studies. The Hardangerfjord in Norway, the Atlantic Sea coast of Ireland and France, the Algarve coast of Portugal, and the Adriatic Sea coast of Italy, with centered around Ancona, and the coastal North Sea, the southern part of the North Sea, divided between 3 countries, the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. And a small part of the Baltic Sea called the Archipelago Sea, an important area for aquaculture and small-scale fisheries. It's between the Finnish mainland and the Åland archipelago in the middle of the Baltic Sea. These are the case studies. Now we're moving to one of the case studies. This is just outside the city of Faro. It's close to the city of Alhau.
My university.
And your university. We are very close, and we didn't plan this, but we did field studies in the shellfish area there, which are very traditional, as you can see, for the way they are digging for the shells. But my point here is this is also a cultural landscape. Just like if you move around in this country, for instance, you see a lot of agriculture. It has been so for a long time. The Algarve coast is a place where you can see actually aquaculture going on, and it has gone on for a long time. So it's a cultural landscape. It's being preserved as they also cultivate their shells. So it's an important part of landscape conservation, and also contributes quite a lot to the seafood production in the region. But the Algarve Sea Coast case study includes more than that. The rectangle at the bottom of this includes an offshore aquaculture facility, which is at the moment in an experimental scale, where they are testing various concepts for offshore aquaculture of shellfish and several fish species in this area. This is the Norwegian study area. It's the Hardangerfjord, and as you can see from the picture, it's a fjord, which means it's an enclosed by land. It's still marine waters. This is sea, but it's very different, special hydrographic capabilities which has some effect on the aquaculture and fisheries going on there. This is the fisheries in the area, but to us Norwegians, we are quite proud of the salmon. I shall not insult the Icelandic and the Scottish here, but most of the Atlantic salmon goes up in the Norwegian rivers, so it's more about responsibility. We cannot afford to destroy that species. It's a part of the cultural heritage, and it would be a crime against nature to destroy it. So we have some strong wild salmon stocks, but there are major challenges on how to govern the aquaculture industry in such a way that it does not kill off the natural cousin of the same species. So this is how we want to have it. It's a nice area, everybody is happy, and the fish is getting food, so it's happy too. And now you see the aquaculture permits, which gives us the challenge here. We have a large aquaculture industry. Now 70% of the country's incomes from aquaculture and fisheries combined are now from salmonids, cultured salmonids. And together they constitute the second largest industry in the country. So the country's major export, as you know, is oil and gas, but the second most important one is fish. It's really important to keep it that way, and there is growth potential in the blue sector, which is really interesting. And as you know, oil and gas is going down, environmental issues and so on. It will come to an end. Aquaculture and fisheries hopefully will not come to an end. But the enormous amount of permits is a situation different from anywhere else in Europe. So there are challenges from this, and of course it was interesting to compare this with the situation in the other case studies. This is two of the two major forms they're using. You see in the background there are sea cage facilities, and in the foreground there are smolt facilities. They are on freshwater where the small babies are kept. And in the fjord just back of that, there is on-growth facilities for salmon. This has been developed enormously technologically. These kind of installations can be up to, actually there are installations up to 180 meters in diameter, so they can be rather enormous, keeping a large number of salmon. They are very robust in storms, and they are typically placed rather on exposed areas for several reasons, mainly environmental. But the technological challenges of that kind of aquaculture is quite enormous, and this of course is only feasible in large scale. No, there are different carrying capacities. There is algal growth as the result of excess feed. There is impact on the seabed. There is impact by salmon lice and wild fish. Now I have 3 examples. If I now take this line here, you can see actually one of them is actually limiting the growth. And it's not by coincidence that the salmon lice is at the moment limiting the entire growth of the Norwegian aquaculture industry. The salmon lice problem is big. It's much more important than the others. Actually, if it was for this, the so-called pollution, which gives algal growth and impact on seabed, the judgment by us at the Institute of Marine Research is that those factors are not limiting the Norwegian aquaculture industry. We should focus on the salmon lice, because that is actually a much more important environmental impact, which is now limiting. But of course, there is an impact on the seabed. There is always an impact, an ecological impact of aquaculture. And you cannot produce food without having an ecological impact. Agriculture has an enormous ecological impact. You have to choose what impact you like to have, and what you want to have, and that's a purely political decision. And of course, fisheries also has a major impact, and it's a political decision what is an acceptable impact. So we analyzed in the Coexist project. This is from the Adriatic Sea case study, but actually it was done by Imares in the Netherlands. They construct aquaculture and fisheries and other activities with cables and pipelines, with oil and gas extractions and mussel fisheries. Actually, there was a synergy there, partly because of installations. As we analyzed the various, I'm just showing this as an example, because as we analyzed the various activities, conflict was not the only thing we found. We found that there were actually activities that had synergies with each other. And this was just one of them. Other things could be that the tourist activities were not necessarily in conflict with the aquaculture activities, because the tourists became interesting in this new cultural landscape in front of them. They were interested in seeing salmon or mussels in Portugal being cultured. They were interested in local food, as they were interested in the local fisheries. So there are not only conflicts to be analyzed there, synergies are just as important. And if there is a blue growth to be realized, synergies is one of the keys. We did evaluation of spatial management tools. I have to do that a little fast to give some time here. But we did develop a framework for a multi-objective, quantitative and qualitative evaluation of marine spatial management of coastal zones. We analyzed the marine spatial management in the 6 case studies by identifying relevant alternatives, by identifying relevant objectives in the area. Those were extremely different. And by using weights and preferences, by interviewing key stakeholders in the area. And we did we did an MCA matrix and using suitable MCA techniques to analyze the various alternatives here. So the framework was developed, and what came out of it was an evaluation of adaptation and proposing improvements to marine spatial management in very different case studies. Conflicts, there are competition for space, which means that one activity excludes another. One very important factor is not in my neighborhood factors. Principally, one activity does not exclude others, but may not be wanted by the others. Most people tend to think that climate is an important thing and windmills are nice, but they don't want them in their neighborhood. Many people also tend to see that fish farms are nice, but they also want to fish there, they want to have tourism there, and they want to have recreation there. So they don't want them to be too close to their summer houses and so on. But then there are synergies. Fish farms can be considered part of a cultural landscapes, which can be interesting for tourists. It's a local food production, a slow food. You want to see some local sea life? Come to the fish farm and see it. So 2 activities may use the same area. It's quite interesting to see that the Algarve had aquaculture activity. The Hardangerfjord, second major, its most important industry is fish farming, but very close to that is tourism in the area. It's a nice area. People go there as tourists. So it's an important area. Never mind the date. That's in the bottom there. That's a bug. It should have been out. The legislation, there's a wide variety through Europe. We analyzed the various legislative systems throughout Europe. I'm surprised to see how much variety there is. To put that in 2 sentences, the countries with little or no aquaculture do not have adequate legislation. They don't have aquaculture, so they don't have legislation. But as they don't have legislation, they cannot get any aquaculture. It's an evil circle. Countries with aquaculture do, to a varying degree, enhance the possibility to develop aquaculture, and legislation is a means to do that. Now, let's turn to one of the major impact on the environment, the impact of pathogens. We know that there are pathogen reservoirs in wild organisms, that pathogens proliferate in aquaculture. There's movement to aquacultured organisms, which are vectors for pathogens. Diseases are the most important limiting factor in aquaculture. I can say worldwide. It has a direct impact, which is mortality. Pathogens can be amplified within farm, causing significant infection pressures towards wild stocks. Aquaculture and coastal management practices influence the transmission and impact of pathogens. So these diseases are an integral part of nature. There is no thing as a disease-free world. There is no such thing as a disease-free wild population. That only exists in the imaginary world of some environmental NGOs. This is something out there in nature. We can manage it to some extent, because human behavior affects the proliferation and distribution of pathogens, so we have to think smart to keep the problem at a sustainable level. There are a lot of lessons learned, and if you ask a Chilean or a Norwegian who is a little older, my age, there is often very expensive learning. as Norway had its major crackdowns of its aquaculture industry in the late 80s and the early 90s, with high antibiotics consumption and so on, Chile has just been through that. By introduction of diseases, uncontrolled proliferation of diseases, and crackdowns which almost killed off the industry, both in Norway and Chile and Scotland. There is an exchange of pathogens between wild and farmed fish. All the pathogens originate from the wild organisms, which is the reservoir. There is a high density in farmed organisms, so there is a possibility for proliferation of pathogens and enhancement of virulence there. So there are various epidemiological models that can be used here. I shall not go deep detail into that. But one thing is important. In epidemiological studies, there is a critical threshold called the NT, which is exactly the maximum number of susceptible individuals which are to be kept in an area. So the total number of area is N, and the susceptible individuals are NT. In aquaculture of fish, not on shellfish, but on fish, you have one golden opportunity, which is to manipulate the ratio between NT and N by vaccinating the fish. Vaccines is the key to industrialized aquaculture. You can vaccinate fish, you cannot vaccinate shellfish. Vaccines are in practice limited to vertebrates, with some exception to shrimps, which I shall not go into. But this manipulation has proven to be the key, both to get the big production, but also to get much more environmental sustainable situation. Because vaccines is the reason why the Norwegian aquaculture industry has been able to grow without using antibiotics to excess farms. I mean, Norway is a small country. We use about 50 tons of antibiotics in the country as a whole. In fish farming, we use about 1 ton of antibiotics per year, which is an exceptionally low number compared to agriculture in anywhere. So this is quite important. I shall not go into the network models. They work at different scales in time and space. They actually take place, they study the movements that do take place. If we transport equipment or fish from one farm to another, do we transport the diseases or so? So what kind of tools do we have? We can manipulate the distance between farms, the maximum amount of animals per farm, the maximum impact of environment. We can use fallowing as a strategy, restriction of movement, restriction on sources of juveniles, and use specific pathogen-free quality and screening for pathogens. We can take a look at the seabed. An unaffected area is the D in the bottom right, whereas the A, B, and C shows an increased biodiversity and increased biomass. That is the direct impact of something going on the surface, which is actually a fish farm where something is fed. Now, we have defined what is an acceptable change of the seabed. An acceptable change is an increased biodiversity and biomass. If it's reduced, it's not accepted, and if it is becoming anoxic, the fish farm has to close. So the impact on the seabed is quite important. It's one of the factors that we actually govern the farming after. Now the little animal here, which is quite nice, is the salmon lice, and this is the Hardangerfjord from the air. It's the area where salmon lice lives. So these are the sea permits. Now I'm going to show you what will happen if we artificially release some sea lice in the area, how they spread. The reason why they spread is that even though there are only a few lice per fish in farms, there has never been so much salmon along the Norwegian and European coast as it is now. Artificially, in fish farms, there are much more salmon than it has been anywhere before. So the small number of salmon that comes out of the rivers, which of course are not protected, they will meet an enormous amount of sea lice larvae, which can bite on the fish and infest the fish. Even worse, we have manipulated the hydrodynamics of the fjords because there are hydroelectric power plants there. No, there is little fresh water there. by the natural situation where the smolt goes out is a lot of fresh water coming out because of this. In the summer, everything comes down from the mountain, so there's a lot of fresh water which skates around on the top of the water column. So in much fresh water, the salmon and the lice meet in this area between this freshwater layer and the seawater layer. This is the hotspot of infections. There will be many meetings in the situation that we have created by using the hydroelectric power plants, whereas in the natural situation there would have been few meetings. So the way we use the energy facilities also influence this interface between the wild fisheries of salmon and the aquaculture of the salmon. Now I'm going to artificially release some salmon lice in this area. Actually, on the top around 1 o'clock, you can see that is peninsula where Bergen is, and you can see actually the fjord stretching into the country. The North Sea is to the upper 11 o'clock in this picture. Now I've released it 1 day, 2 days, 3 days after release. As you can see, the salmon lice larvae are spreading in an enormous area. This is an area about, I would say, 1/3 of Denmark in size. So it's been released from a small area. This animal is perfectly designed. It's one of the wonders of evolution to spread around. They are spreading around from river to river. They should find new hosts. So the morale of this is that it's capable of spreading in very large area, which means this animal is dangerous. So right now, the impact for aquaculture is that the escapees and the salmon lows, escapees I haven't talked about, those are salmon that escape, are given the red light. They are now limiting the growth. Antibacterials we hardly use anymore, so there is green light. But antiparasitics has become a problem. In order to fight the salmon lice, a large amount of salmon lows, antiparasitics is used. Whereas other things have the green light or yellow lights. So spreading of this highly specialized pathogens can be very efficient. Management on farm level is not enough. You cannot leave this to the farmers. It has to be done on a higher level. It has to be on the level of municipalities or even counties. But then you can use synchronized treatments, mandatory synchronized prophylaxis, and etc., various principles around that. And of course, it has to be local scale considerations too. So we have produced this book again, which it can be given around. It actually shows this kind of from tools to practical examples for the very different case studies. But the major thing is that how we can reduce the level of conflicts between the various aspects, even you have between the various users, even if there is a lot of aquaculture in the area or there is only a small aquaculture activity in the area. There I've left some booklets of the Mermaid project around. One of the ways actually to reduce the pressure on the coastal zones is quite obvious: to go offshore. So the Commission has given 3 different projects on offshore multipurpose platforms for aquaculture and energy production, and we are designing one of them with various case studies like this, actually on how to produce various aquaculture products together with floating or demersal wind turbines. So that is one. Actually, this is one of the. This windmill actually exists. It's the largest floating windmill in the world. So, thank you for your attention. And this is mandatory.
So, thank you, Øyvind. We have only 5 minutes left for discussion and questions. Welcome question from the audience. Just push the microphone so that your voice is going to be recorded.
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Geir Oddsson from the Nordic Council of Ministers. I noticed that neither of you mentioned offshore oil and gas as a potential conflict area. Despite, Øyvind, you were looking at the offshore potential of aquaculture, and it's a big discussion in Norway. taking aquaculture offshore because of, well, we saw the map, that's the reason. So you would imagine then that the conflicts between offshore and offshore aquaculture would become an issue. Is that something that you've been looking at in sort of spatial planning in Norway?
I can comment on that. It's been looked upon in the as a conflict between fisheries and oil and gas, which is enormous. I guess it's enormous in all oil-producing countries. It's the same in the UK. Especially, one particularly important area is the Lofoten-Vesterålen area, which is actually the hatching ground of the Northeast Atlantic cod, by far the most important cod stock in the world. Right now, there is no oil activity there apart from seismological activity, which is highly disputed. To some extent, there is a conflict, but there is also a tendency. It's quite interesting that the oil companies are partners in the offshore aquaculture facilities. One of the reasons, I think, is that they want to see what are we going to use with our competence and how are we going to use the installations after the oil age. The competence is enormous. The windmill I showed you is actually developed by Statoil. The turbine is a standard Siemens windmill. There's nothing new about it. The floating construction is something out of Statoil, which has been developed out of the oil industry. Which is interesting because it can be used for new purposes. And they also have technology which can be very interesting in an aquaculture context. Because we cannot go offshore without developing new technology. This is a huge engineering task. One of the main risks, of course, is escapees. And you don't want a major aquaculture facility in the middle of the North Sea to escape and invade everything of wild stocks in the area. So there are a lot of challenges there. Yes, there is a conflict for space with the existing oil and gas industry. But when it comes to windmills, there is one thing which is important. Windmills don't go so well together with the fisheries. You can't have fishing vessels in between the windmills. But you could have aquaculture facilities because they can move in a coordinated way. They can have the same manager. They can have a system of operations that ensures that this can be done safe. So multi-use is important also when we go offshore.
So thank you. One question from the lady with a white shirt.
Very short question. Since we are in a bioeconomy conference, and earlier today we heard from the SCAR representative that there will be a lack of biomass, and that there should be public policies to ensure that we have enough biomass. But I see that especially SCAR and I'm also part of Biotechnology, they do not kind of take into account that there is the ocean, which is full of biomass, and you mentioned that we are producing biomass through aquaculture, for example, on the seabed. So if you could, both of you, elaborate a little bit on this aspect.
Yeah. Should I start? I like to.
Please be concise. We have two further questions.
Yeah. There is a shortage of food for aquaculture, but there is a potential for development, partly by using agricultural products, partly by cultivating algae and going down the food web. So developing this can increase the amount of available biomass from the ocean.
Yes, I think one of the big growth areas will be about cultivating algae, and where we will cultivate algae and how, and what sort of algae. But there's a huge potential there as well.
Mister?
Good evening. I'm Paola Reale from the Bioeconomy Observatory. I would like to ask you just two quick questions to Mr. Olvind. So first, have you ever compared intensive aquaculture? I'm talking about the inland aquaculture. So have you ever compared the intensive one with the organic one to try, because for example, with the ponds instead of raceways, to try somehow to have a solution for from the environmental point of view and also for the welfare and so the density of the fish and from the social point of view, because you said to try to reach the population attention to the aquaculture in general. And the second one is really a quick one about the vaccination. At what stage of the life of the fish do you do vaccination? Because it's important from a food point, consumer point of view.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I could take the last one first, because the second one is just as much for you, I think. But it's in vaccination. Salmonids are vaccinating well before, at least a month before they are put into sea. So we are utilizing, they hatch in freshwater. They are kept in freshwater until they reach a certain stage where they are mature for vaccinations, when they are vaccinated. So at the time when they are reached the sea, they have already developed immunity. It takes some time after vaccination to develop immunity. So that has been a key issue in actually both in fish welfare to avoid those diseases and also from an environmental point of view.
Well, I'm an advocate of not cultivating vertebrates, but going lower down the food chain. So my advice would be to cultivate bivalves, because from the ecological point of view, it's far more beneficial, but it's also much, it's much more ecologically viable than to be feeding vertebrates and waiting much longer. I mean, we can get the bivalves to the table very quickly.
But in terms of ecotoxicology, I mean, bivalves are good biofilter, and then they filter every kind of nasty compounds.
Yes, and who's put the compounds in the water? Us.
Okay. Jack Fuchs, DG Research, Marine Unit. So just to continue what you have just elaborated a bit, I think I like very much your two presentations where we really develop in details what are the potential for the cost. But what is really missing, I think, and this dimension of and I was expecting more in your presentation, the interface and the interaction between land and sea. And here we have a big issue which has not been addressed for years, which still not be addressed. When I see the participant in the room, there is nobody from Agri except some. So the land-sea interaction. Because, for example, I was surprised when you say fishery and aquaculture are producing a lot of plastic. It is not true. 80% of the marine plastic come from lands. And all the contaminants, all the practice on the agriculture has an impact on coastal. And this, for me, I would like to have your opinion on this. I think it's a subject very important to be addressed in the future. So,
well, actually, my specialization is eutrophication. That's what I work on. My research is on eutrophication. So I agree with you completely. There is a conflict there. And I was concerned when I was at the HOPE conference that the agricultural sector was not represented. The agri-chemical sector wasn't there either. And most surprising also was the maritime transport sector. There were no representatives whatsoever of those three sectors at the HOPE conference. So there's definitely a disconnect there. But I completely agree with you that the land-ocean interactions is where it's at. And when I talked about the litter, I also know that most of the litter comes down the rivers. But what I what I was trying to say is that even with the fisheries and with the aquaculture, you do get this detritus. And some of it, of course, because it's made to withstand the sea, it's really not very biodegradable.
I would say I've not worked so much with the land part of the coastal zone myself. It's the coexist was limited to yeah. 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 Yeah.
Was mainly inspired from LOI-CZ project.
But I think I would add that competing claims for the coastal zones is a major problem and challenge, because especially the tourist industry, especially rich people move to the coast and they're actually blocking the development. There is a reason why the populated and popular tourist areas along the Mediterranean don't develop major aquaculture industries. There are other activities going on there. One important exception is Greece, which has developed actually aquaculture industry. You can see exactly the same development in British Columbia and Canada, where there is a relatively strong aquaculture industry, but it's also a place that, as Canadians say, rich Canadians go there when they retire to be close to their parents. So it's a lot of competing claims there. I think synergies, focus on synergies, is a key there. I don't think there is any other way to reduce the pressure on the coastal zones than develop systems where various different users can coexist with each other.
The transport of nutrients and pollutants from the land to the sea is a well-studied topic now. We know how much, we know how it's transported, we know how. What we don't know, and this is what we need to address, is how we can stop it. And we can only stop it by changing the way people do their agriculture, by the way the people do their industry on land. This is why the human dimension is really important. But there's a disconnect, because some of the lobbies on land are so strong that, you know, fisheries are diminishing, you know, so what? What's the problem? And if you look at the situation in Europe, we're actually much better off than they are in the United States, you know, with the Gulf of Mexico problem. It's quite ironic that BP are being fined so much for a dead zone, was something that we've known as the dead zone for years. But the real issue is, how do we change the way that the agricultural products, the agri-chemicals are applied? And that's something that, as oceanographers, we can't solve. We can only do it through society. And I'm a really strong believer that European policies and policies can work. We've seen that with the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, lowering the phosphorus. We haven't seen it with the nitrate directive. It hasn't been effective in the same way. And we also can see, in the OSPAR work I did, you could see clearly that the lead was coming down, the amount of lead that was being transported in the atmosphere. But a lot of the agricultural chemicals, even some that are banned, that nobody admits to using, we can find them. So there's a problem there.
So thank you. I would like to conclude this workshop and make an official announcement for tomorrow. The conference is going to start at 8:40 and not 8:30. It's from Fabio Ferra's message. So thank you for participating, and good evening.
Yes.
We all have to take the
Get out.
bus.
We have to get out.
We have to take a
Yes.
bus to
To the hotel.